Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and my guests today are Gaisu Yari, Mariam Solaimankhil, and Jason Howk. We'll be discussing the third round of international talks in Doha, Qatar, which from this particular round, the Taliban are including themselves, and Afghan women have been excluded from those talks. And the issues impacting Afghan women have been banned from discussion, although UN officials will tell you that they are talking about women's issues in the form of counter narcotics and private industry and banking, which are women's issues if you listen to some UN officials, but not the massive loss of human rights that Afghan women have endured for the last 3 years almost. I want to keep introductions brief today just because I want to have as much time as possible for discussion of these really important events. Mariam Solaimankhil is a former member of the Parliament of the Government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the former Afghan government. Gaisu Yari is a human rights activist, writer, and speaker who has fought for freedom in Afghanistan and vocally opposed the Taliban's repressive rule there. Jason Howk, you guys recognize, I'm sure, is a U.S. Army veteran and the director of Global Friends of Afghanistan. I want to thank you guys all for joining me today. It's really great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Beth. It's always an honor.
Thank you, Beth, for everything you do. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight.
Well, I'd love to get started. It's kind of hard to figure out who to ask first for any context on this issue. I gave a very brief background of the Doha talks. I guess why don't we go around and everybody kind of talk about maybe the parts of this whole galling expedition that have been the most frustrating to you or that have surprised you the most about this particular round of conversations regarding Afghanistan and its present and future. I'm going to say, Gaisu, would you like to start off?
Sure. Thank you again. I think I am showing the frustration as much as all, Afghans and Afghan activists and allies of us are showing that frustration, and that is real. Especially, I think the third Doha talk actually is a real talk, and that we are excluded from. I think one of the things that came to me and that I had to think about was the fact that UN system and its two phases. For instance, we had the special rapporteur reporting on the human rights, violation and the status of human rights in Afghanistan, and the Human Rights Council, perhaps not too long ago, right? And then you also see UN making a decision to sit with the Taliban, with a terrorist group, where the people of Afghanistan are not accepting them, right? That's not part of what people want inside Afghanistan. And you see that the UN on the other side is going to sit with them to negotiate, right? And certain things that are not the priority for us, for women in Afghanistan and women's rights activists who have fought for our rights for years in Afghanistan, and we gained those rights, right? Not easily, right? We had so many sacrifices. You see the loss we have had right now and the kind of brutal violations that this terrorist group in Afghanistan violated for years and decades are welcomed, right, on the Doha talk, but perhaps the people of Afghanistan, I think the women's rights groups and the activists are not welcomed, and they're excluded just to, I guess, because of the noise that exists in the media and social media and different platforms. They are trying to sideline you and just basically tell you that, I'm going to give you an opportunity on the third day to sit with you and talk to you. But we are not perhaps the priority as we feel, right? Now, I think this 2 UN phase is bizarre to me personally, and I think that's probably the hardest part that I cannot, process.
I think that one thing that summed it up for me was listening to Rosa Otunbayeva, who's the head of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, saying, well, we'll sit with them and tell them that this isn't how it works. We don't leave women out. And it's like, but then you're sitting with them. You've brought all these 25 countries envoys here to tell them that this isn't how it works. You're showing them how it works. How dare you? It was I was listening to her interview, and every part of it I thought, this is wrong. this is wrong. She then went on to say that, the Taliban are from the mountains. They don't understand, and it was just such a misunderstanding of who the Taliban are and what they are capable of. And the people who have seen that the most are Afghan women. So it is just such a slap in the face to Afghan women to have that happen. Mariam, I'd love your take on this.
To be honest with you, Beth, I'm not surprised whatsoever. What do you expect from the Taliban? Where I am a little surprised are the 25 countries that allowed their delegates to go sit with the Taliban with no women at the table. What you're saying is that it's okay, that you accept the fact that there is no women at the table. And that was the most disappointing and hurtful part as an Afghan woman. When you look at women's rights in Afghanistan, historically, our women have been empowered. We have women in our stories. We have women ministers. We had women's rights before the United States had women's rights. But we're going through a period of time where systematically there are neighboring countries and world powers that want to weaponize my people and use them for their own political gains. Every time you see Russia getting a little bit strong, socialism coming in a little bit this way, then you're going to start seeing more of this extremism and Islamic extremism. And who do they weaponize? Somehow it's been my people, our Afghan people. And it's enough. We don't want to see this anymore. When I heard Christina Amanpour's interview the other day, she had said that this is the largest women's rights crisis in the world. Over 20 million people in Afghanistan are women. Over 20 million people, over 50% of the nation. Right now, if you add up Gaza as well as Israel, you're not going to reach 20 million people. What's happening in Afghanistan right now is the largest human rights crisis that's happening in the world, and it has global implications. It's been 3 years. I know Gaisu feels it, and I feel it as well, and Jason has been there since pre-fall supporting us. We've been screaming into the void, warning the entire world about what's happening today. And educate why are women not allowed at the table? Number one, it's a bargaining chip for the Taliban. The Taliban, if you let girls go to school tomorrow, what difference does it make? You're going to start seeing female suicide bombers. I'm glad. I'm one of the only people who will loudly say this. I'm glad that women aren't allowed to go to school under the Taliban regime. If I had a son who lived in Afghanistan right now, I wouldn't allow that for him to go to school under the Taliban regime as well. The curriculum matters. What are they learning? What are they teaching? The other day, we heard news that in Kandahar, cricket was banned. They're not allowed to play cricket anymore because it's an art. It's something that they can enjoy. You have to have people living in fear. So what happens from that? And we already have reports. We already have on-the-ground reports of people being brainwashed into a line of thought where they hate the West. So we're growing a group of people who are terrorized, who are scared, and we don't know what the next, I know, and you know what the next few years are going to hold globally. But this is an old game that's on repeat for decades now, and it's time for it to end. The way I feel today is as if, imagine if tomorrow the Nazis got up and said, you know what, we've changed. We're not the same Nazis as before. Give us another chance. And Hitler was reborn and said, let me get another shot at it. And the world said, all right, you go do it. They get their country back. And then they're like, okay, we took our country, we brought in back our Jews, and no monitoring, no freedom of press, no one's allowed to speak. And send us your travel bloggers to say how wonderful we are. And give us $40 million a week. Give us all of that. Why are the Taliban allowed to rebrand themselves? Why are they? I still can't comprehend why they're allowed to rebrand themselves and why 25 delegates are sitting in Doha right now at a show, at a joke of a conference, discussing counter narcotics and money with a bunch of backwards men who are not, in my eyesight or in Gaisu's eyesight, come from our culture, from our identity, from our history. They know nothing of it. There's something new that was born in the last few decades.
Absolutely spot on. And it's funny, as a journalist, you have to ask uncomfortable questions to people that you don't want to even talk to. And I've had to ask questions of Suhail Shaheen a couple times. And the only time he's ever answered me is for this article when I said, what about the allegations that women are being raped in Taliban prison? What about all of the human rights violations against women? And the only thing he could say was, well, we do have girls in school. There are girls in medical schools. And I said, okay, but what about when you cut off access after 6th grade? There won't be any high school graduates. How are you going to make up that difference? There might be some girls in college type environments now, but what happens next? And he didn't answer that part. And about the rapes, he said it was just Western media accusations. And as you say, there is no free press. So there is no free press inside Afghanistan that's able to report on those things. But the UN is investigating, and it goes back to your original point, Gaisu, of like, well, you're investigating these horrid rapes, women getting killed. It's not just women being raped in prison, it's women being impregnated and forced to have abortions in prison. And some of them being so in such a bad state of health from repeated sexual assault that they kill them. These are not light accusations. The UN is investigating them. And for the Taliban to just say, well, it's just Western propaganda, that shows you who you're up against. Who we're up against are, Jason, you always say it, you call a spade. They're terrorists. That's who they are. So Jason, I'd love to have you weigh in.
I love how we just showed an example of what the United Nations could have done in Doha in the last 2 days. They could have invited more women than men, and they should have let the women speak first and let the men sit there quietly and listen. That's it. How simple of a concept. We just did it in 10 minutes to show you how to... I don't even go on events anymore. If it's not more women than there are men, I just don't go. Because this is the time that we need to be listening to the women of Afghanistan. I've been dealing with the so-called negotiations with the Taliban since 2009 with the Afghan government. And I have watched them put forward their red lines, their negotiating points. And they are not negotiating points. He even said it today. One of the Taliban spokespersons said, these are our demands to the world. They are holding all of the people of Afghanistan as hostages, and their demands are that you give us a terrorist organization recognition as a government and let us have all the money and economic connections we want and take all the sanctions off us and our families so we can travel freely and never be punished for being terrorists and never be punished for running a gender apartheid system. They are committing crimes against humanity every single day, and the UN just gave them exactly what they wanted. They kicked every legitimate voice about Afghanistan out of the room and brought in a terrorist group to sit in the room with diplomats who are hated by the majority of Afghanistan. That is just so backwards as far as diplomacy goes. I was raised a soldier, but I got involved with diplomacy in 2009 and have been watching this and been a part of this since then. We are giving the Taliban every meeting exactly what they want. And somehow they trick us into thinking we got progress when all we did was give them exactly what they want. And the UN is tying themselves up in knots, trying to defend the stupidity of doing it this way. And I have said it in many articles and interviews. There should be hundreds of women from Afghanistan that are in exile or brought in, sitting in that room every single time the diplomats want to meet. And the Taliban should be standing outside, banging on the door, wishing they were legitimate enough to come in and talk about their country. That's where they need to sit until they lose power again. I don't think they're going to change. They never have. They never do. They don't negotiate. They don't give up anything. So they should be locked out of negotiations. They should be sanctioned harder. And the UN has got to stop thinking they're making progress. They have thrown women under the bus, and then they drove the bus themselves back and forth over the women until they stopped screaming. But this group, especially that you're seeing here, are not going to let those screams die. There is going to be more yelling and more gnashing of teeth until the world realizes they've done the stupidest thing you could with the terrorist group.
As always, well spoken, Jason. I would love to know, Gaisu and Mariam, you guys know women back in Afghanistan and the way that they're living under the Taliban. And so what I would love is to hear from you both about what is the female experience in Afghanistan right now, so we can all understand exactly what, the Taliban have done to Afghan women outside of just, what we see in the media about edicts and orders. What is life like for Afghan women? I don't know. I guess we'll start with Mariam this time.
Thank you, Beth. I think the Taliban are being really careful right now. In some of the city centers, you're seeing pictures of women in face covered around the city with male chaperones, which was similar to majority of the Republic time too. Women weren't dressed provocatively or without headscarf or anything throughout the last 20 years. But the scary parts are whenever you're talking to families who don't want you to go on record. I'm part of an NGO called Afghan Peace Watch, and we have a network of journalists and people on the ground who report to us with data about what's happening. So there are families right now who will murder their wife. Someone in the girl's family will go and tell the Taliban that this woman was murdered. The Taliban will say, okay, well, that's a family issue. We don't get involved in family issues. There are people right now who stood up against the Taliban from the beginning who are still in jail. We have members of the robotics teams who are still in jail to this day that no one talks about anymore. We have videos upon videos of women being publicly lashed for crimes of adultery or having a boyfriend or falling in love or anything like this. They could get publicly lashed, and the reason they do that is to set an example for the rest of the community. But the list goes on. I don't know where to begin and where not to. A lot of the stories that I have, I can't even tell you guys everything because of those people's safety. At the same time, you open your mouth and you're still in the country, you or your family are going to be arrested or killed. Just to touch this back to the UN issue, I'm guessing that Gaisu has gone through the same thing that I have. Majority of the time, whenever you want to speak about an issue, and they know where you stand, they'll say something like, "Oh, well, you're not in the country anymore, so you can't speak." Okay, so someone from the country, you expect someone who lives in Afghanistan, has their family in Afghanistan, to open their mouth and speak. Each and every refugee that's come out is deeply rooted in Afghanistan, and we have to respect that. And we're their only outlet to tell the real stories while keeping them safe. So I hope that the international community in the U.S. In particular changes their policy on this. It's a huge mistake, and I have to say, okay, the UN is to blame, but so is the U.S. Their stance with Pakistan, the way that they've funded Pakistan throughout the years, held them, and they have not held them accountable for harboring the Taliban for the last 20 years and providing them with everything to be weaponized today. We need to discuss this another time. It's a big topic, but it's important.
Beth, I would like to jump in because I have been working on a storytelling project inside Afghanistan. I have recorded, interviewed a lot of women. Started from Kandahar to Bamiyan to Kabul. And I think when we are talking about a gender apartheid system, when you talk to these women, to their stories and their daily lives, I think you feel it, right? It's real and it happens in every corner of the country. I also had a trip to Pakistan. I returned 2 days ago. You imagine the women, for instance, protesters who are trying to cross border to escape the Taliban, and how the Taliban treat them on the border, although they have visas to enter Pakistan, because they don't have a mahram. Listen, if you're a widow, you have 3 children, you need to find food for your children. What are you going to do? Are you going to just look around to find a man so that can help you to just cross the border, right? I talked to a woman who is based in Kandahar, and she told me that, you know what's really bizarre? She has to walk 3 hours because taxi drivers are not stopping their cars for this woman because the Taliban told them that single woman should not be picked up from the street. And I talked to a woman in Kabul, and she told me, listen, every day I come, I try to change my route if I go to a grocery store because the Taliban are coming after me and they harass me. They ask me and they tell me, you know what, your time is over. You cannot just walk around the way you used to. You need to come in my car, right? these are real, and this is what women actually face and experience in Afghanistan. You just saw the decree about, women teachers. Their salaries became 5,000 Afghanis, equal for everybody. Now there is a protest going on internally, and I'm sure all of these women will be put in prison. Either it's the health workers, it's the teachers, or anybody. They are trying to raise their voices because they're going to suffer. Their children are going to die because they need their salaries, right? It's not going to be given to them because Haybatullah needs to have more money in Kandahar, right? Or other groups need to have more money for their, luxurious life in Kabul than just teachers who are teaching until at least 6th grade. I think I have listened to so many stories, and I think when you listen to this, it's not only about what media says. I think when you talk to these women on the ground and how their daily lives and their suffering shows you that this is a gender apartheid system. And I think the implementation of these decrees are real. Sometimes you hear in the media with the people saying that, oh, it's just a decree, it's not going to be implemented. It's institutionalized. There are specific units within the capital and also the provinces and within districts. Within the district governors, there are specific units that are responsible to implement decrees. So it's very systematic. It's not only on the news. It's not only about people who are complaining. But I think I just need to be more involved. I think the people, if they are trying to be allies and sympathizers of the Taliban, they need to read, they need to talk to people on the ground to see what it really means, how long it takes from women to leave their house to go to a grocery store and come back. It used to take them from 10 minutes of experience. Now it takes them 2 hours of experience because they need to think about how they're going to get out, what they're going to wear, right? When they go on the street, who are they going to confront? Who are they going to talk to? If they will be caught, how they're going to navigate their ways back, or they release themselves, right? Because your phones are going to be checked. Like the way you're dressed up is going to be checked. As simple as wearing a colorful scarf is problematic now on the streets of, not even thinking about other provinces, Kabul, right? When I see these stories, Beth, believe me, I feel that the international community needs to listen to this. And this is the reality. It's not only about the UN trying to compromise about how many projects they need to implement in Afghanistan. And the humanitarian aid that's poured in UN agencies needs to be implemented. And I think checking the box is more important than what women suffer on the ground. Is bizarre, right? It's just bizarre. It's when you talk about it, they say, oh, you're the angry woman who is just talking about blah, blah, right? But when you show evidence, they don't want to see the evidence. That is the problem. When I tell them that, listen, I collected 230 stories after the Afghanistan collapse and individual experiences of what it meant to escape Taliban and how brutal they are, right? And the experience from 1996 to 2001, and then people experienced that, they wanted to escape that. And then also now collecting stories of women in Afghanistan is actually showing the reality of where we are. And I think we are losing a lot of time. I think 2.5 years are a very long time, and we're approaching August again. 3 years of girls, not going to school or not working. I agree with Mariam that if I had a daughter in Afghanistan, I wouldn't let her to go to school because I didn't want to train another terrorist who would just explode.
Something I saw on, I want to say X a while back, but it was basically this thought that these restrictions that the Taliban are creating have changed the mindset already of even Afghan men, where they're ready to say, no, we need to enforce, hijab because it's important. And it's not just I'm afraid that I'm going to be targeted by the Taliban because my female relative is not wearing hijab properly. It's, well, maybe they're right. And that's really scary, is if people are starting to adopt the Taliban point of view. And I see it. I know, Jason, you see me seeing it every time that I mention Afghan women in my social media space. All of a sudden I get, if it gets enough followers, I get about a dozen Afghan men telling me to shut up about Afghan women, get the name of Afghanistan out of my mouth, making some comments about me.
That's how you know you're doing a good job.
I know,
That's how you know you're amazing.
Right. But it's like, they say it's safer. That's one thing they always say. It's safer for Afghan women. And nothing that you two have described is safe. None of it. It's so despicable to me that that's the word that gets used. It's safer. So please go ahead, respond. I know, Gaisu,
No, because we need to puzzle, right? We need to pause for a second and think about the definition of safety, right? As simple as is possible. And among all these stories that I'm collecting, I think one of the things that comes to me is that, increase on forced marriage, right? A lot of suicide killings of young women, students, right? And is that really safety? Is it? Because I lived in Afghanistan and there was an explosion happening, but the next day we were allowed to go and protest, right? And right now, not having explosion is really safety. I mean, if Afghan men come to you and tell you that, oh, you're not allowed to talk because you are safe, we are not. We are not mentally safe. I think we are in an open prison in Afghanistan where men cannot move themselves either. It's, I think me and Jason were talking about it last week or going on Twitter about to have more men allies to come on board. This is not the story of women alone. This is the story of the Afghan people who are going to suffer more if the Taliban will stay there in the next 2.5 years. 5 years from now, if we will not raise our voice, if we will not come together, if we will not have men allies, I think men will suffer twice as much as women, because women may navigate their ways to survive because I think they are more skillful. I think they are smart enough to do it. But men, I think that men are going to suffer more. And I think I'm calling on all men to come on board. I think this is, when I'm talking about gender apartheid, I'm gender by definition. I'm not talking about women only. I'm talking about men that is also going to be imprisoned and going to get killed and going to be brainwashed.
But right now we're connected to all the men who are still stuck in Afghanistan. Please find me someone who wants to stay there, who doesn't have a second passport, that has the luxury of leaving the country. Even to this day, we're seeing Taliban members like General Mobeen and the other very big influencers of the Taliban who have been arrested numerous times, who aren't able to say what they want, and if they had a chance, they would leave as well. We're seeing a lot of politics happen between the Taliban. The one point I wanted to talk about, bring in on top of what Gaisu said, is the fact that there is no security in Afghanistan. And the biggest problem is that we have these Western bloggers going to Afghanistan, painting this picture that it's perfect. Yeah, because you're not the target. You never were. In the last 20 years, you weren't the target. The people the Taliban were majority of the time killing were Afghans. Why? Because that's how they recruit. And then what do? We're about to see soon what's going to happen. The most important point is that people overlook is that this Taliban 2.0 is much more dangerous than the one from the 90s. They have the entire world with them. They've cut off the world from all access to media and freedom of speech. We have these bloggers, for whatever reason, they're going there and trying to paint a rosy picture of what's going on, and no one's listening. And that's the part that hurts the most. And as a woman who worked tirelessly to get to where I got to, and Gaisu worked tirelessly to get to where she got to, through the shoulders of strong, brave Afghan women, through the decades, if not centuries, that paved the way for us. The least that the world could do is understand that women's rights are human rights, and it's not just an issue that affects Afghans. And as a woman who has the luxury to speak out, to have their own podcast, to go into politics, to work in the UN, how dare you sit at the table with men who look at Afghan women as lesser human beings, as cattle that they can sell or herd or breed with or whatever they want to do, or kill if they feel like. How dare they? I don't know how these women can sleep at night, and I don't know how they have the guts to sit at the same table of them. And I hope each one of their countries recognizes who they are, because at least we live in 2024 and everything's on record now.
When I asked the State Department for this piece about Doha 3, I said, well, who are we sending, right? And they said, oh, well, Tom West and Rina Amiri, but they only agreed to go when they learned that there would be substantive talk about women's issues. And it was, a day later that the Taliban, Zabiullah Mujahid came out and said, no, we won't be talking about women. And it's like, of course not. Everybody knew this. Why do we keep pretending? Why do we keep saying, oh, well, we're going to talk about women. We're going to talk. And no, you're not. It's highly frustrating. And I always remember having Heather Barr on the podcast and talking to her. She was in New York City during 9/11, and she talked about how, actually, she might have talked about this on a different podcast that I watched before she came on mine. I can't even remember anymore. It all blurs together. But what she said was, after that was when everybody talked about, well, we need to go to Afghanistan to save Afghan women. Well, what about the previous 5 years? Did we not need to save Afghan women then? And it is so frustrating because it feels like the world is just turning this blind eye to a problem that is glaring, that impacts every day. You know, you're seeing people dying in Afghanistan, the suicide crisis, and nobody seems to be watching. And we're all actively putting blinders on and pretending like it's not happening. And it is truly despicable. Jason, what are you seeing? Do you see anything good in what is happening in Doha right now? I mean, we have tomorrow, as the day we're recording this, is the second day of the talks with the Taliban. And tomorrow, civil society activists, i.e. women and men, are going to be joining the Taliban. Do you have any hopes for positive engagement on that front?
I don't have any hopes. The UN has already given the Taliban everything they wanted. They have gone home victorious back to Afghanistan not all the way home. They should keep going into Pakistan, but they've gone back to Afghanistan, and they're saying the UN gave us everything we wanted. They're going to help us get rid of all these restrictions on our economy. They're going to let us get these sanctions lifted. We've made great progress in changing the way we're going to deal with counter narcotics, which, I mean, they can make more money from it. They feel like they got exactly what they wanted. And for the American audience who grew up on Charlie Brown and the football, I think you'd understand that it is so sad that the UN keeps walking towards the football to kick it, and the Taliban pull the football away, and the UN falls down and looks stupid. And they do it time after time after time. I don't see why West and Rena even got on a plane. They should not have gone. When I heard that they might not go, I said, that's great. And they should loudly call on other countries. Do not go. Don't go in the room. The second you step in the room with the Taliban and the Haqqani terrorists, you're recognizing them. You're giving them legitimacy. They have no legitimacy inside of Afghanistan. Why give it to them outside? I just can't understand this repeated desire to do that. And I've been watching this since 2009 very closely, trying to give the Taliban the benefit of the doubt when we started that maybe they would actually talk. But all they did was wait. And that is all they ever do. They wait until the leverage changes and they can put more demands forward. And they never give an inch. They're not negotiating partners. So it is ridiculous to invite them to diplomatic events. They're not diplomats. They're a terrorist group and they will not change. You need to sanction them harder. And I don't understand. I was so floored watching the UN diplomats trying to defend why they were even having the Doha talks, how wonderful everything went and it was fruitful. And they're just twisting their words and trying to flip over backwards to paint some picture that everybody knows isn't true. And I don't understand at this point. I mean, it is 2024. Everything's on the record. We're all seeing this in live moment. The Taliban are speaking out quicker than the UN is. We know exactly what happened in there. And it's not good. So nothing good will come of this. I don't know who's going to show up on the third day to speak. I'm sure that they could have just listened to this podcast, get the same information, because it's the same horrible story for everybody inside of Afghanistan, men and women, and children living as prisoners, and their guards are sadistic and evil. We just have to recognize that it's not going to end this way. I hope we start to make some logical choices here. I hope more men get involved in making gender apartheid a crime that can be enforceable, because as we saw Haqqani wander around the Middle East, apparently we've all given up on counterterrorism. So at least we need a gender apartheid law to enable to sanction them in another route and put more pressure on them and other countries who are doing barbaric things to them. But Afghanistan's leading the way right now.
I think I would like to add in terms of our strategic approach in terms of advocacy, because I think looking at countries that are having feminist foreign policies are also bizarre right? If you're looking, I think I was really happy to see a descendant from Canada today, and looking at all these other countries who are valuing, human rights, and that is their top priorities, and they are the one who actually proposed feminist foreign policy started from Europe, right? And you're still looking at their envoys just traveling to Doha, and then certain things you forget. UN forgets, and these countries forgets. They forget CEDA, the mechanism already exists. They forget Resolution 1325, that is about women's participation in all the tables and women leadership, right? And that is a priority for so many countries. And you also have all these other mechanisms that they forget. I don't know what kind of accountability would exist within the UN system that you're committing to have budget for Resolution 1325, its action plan around the world, and you report on it, and then you will not be named and shamed in the UN system. You're going to be a good, you're implementing a good foreign policy, feminist foreign policy. But when it comes to Afghanistan, when it comes to actual practical ways of implementing feminist foreign policy, is when you forget what you actually committed, when you forget what you actually signed on, you forget what you actually budgeted. Every time each country or member states are going to agree on certain, conventions, resolutions, they also budget for it. They have budget and they implement, they report on it. Where is it now, right? That we forget all of these mechanisms that exist, right? You have your policies, and you're really proudly announcing that you have feminist foreign policies, and you're one of those top countries that are prioritizing women globally. But when it comes to women in Afghanistan, you're forgetting all of those.
The Afghan public have yet to recognize the Taliban. In the history of Afghanistan, where we had democratic processes for thousands of years, we have a jirga system. What's a jirga system? From Badakhshan to Bamiyan to Daikundi to Kandahar to Paktia to Khost to Logar to Kabul. Everyone knows who their tribal elders are. Everyone knows who the Khans and Maliks are. Those people are respected. They're invited to a loya jirga, and either in Afghanistan, every single king, every single leader has either been recognized by the people through a loya jirga, or a grand council, a countrywide grand council, or an elections. How are the Taliban recognized? Did they really fight and win a war against US and NATO troops? Did they really? Beth, can you with a straight face tell me that, yeah, the Taliban fought the war against the Afghan ANDSF and the US troops and NATO, and they won? You and I and the rest of the world know the truth. But why are we allowing this terrorist organization to rewrite history and make fools out of all of us? We know the truth, and it's really important for podcasts like yourself to keep this in the eye of the people. Until the Afghan nation recognizes the Taliban, no one has the right to recognize the Taliban. I don't care what country comes there, if it's the United States, UK, the UN, bring everyone there. It doesn't matter until my people themselves say, okay, we recognize them, and without a gun pointed at their head. We don't need that to happen with a gun pointed to with their head.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another question I always ask is, have you asked the women if they like it there? Have you gotten, women aren't even allowed to leave their homes without a man. They don't get to say, yeah, I support the Taliban. How many women? The only woman I've ever met who supported the Taliban was a Western woman. Jason, you know that story. She has some NGO in Afghanistan and, has like the Taliban have bought her off. And she's like, oh no, everybody walks around without hijab.
Anyone,
oh, yeah, that's an exciting
anyone who
idea.
lives in the West, who has the audacity to raise their children in the West and have their family and homes in the West, but then they want Sharia law, the not regular Sharia law, the Taliban ISI made interpretation of Sharia law. For people in Afghanistan, they're hypocrites, and if you dig just a very little bit, they're not good at hiding their bank accounts very well either, or who they're connected with, or who they're dating, or who they're speaking with. You can very, very quickly connect the dots and see why they're really supporting the Taliban. But if you ask a woman right now in Afghanistan if they like the Taliban, they're going to tell you, yeah, we love the Taliban. Why? Because they have a gun pointed at their head. So until there's a mechanism where we can securely find out what the Afghan people want and we neutralize the Taliban, I don't think there's a way forward. I don't think there's any point in any of these discussions. From the beginning, the United States had put different stipulations in the Doha agreement. Did the Taliban follow through with any of them? Do we remember the ceasefire? No, they didn't. Why are we believing them? Why are we still listening to the Taliban? The one thing that they're good at is lying. every word out of the Taliban's mouth is a lie. Don't believe one word that's coming out of their mouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. So what I would love to do, if you ladies would let me ask, is, we know from 96 to 2001, the Taliban did a whole lot of damage to Afghan women that then had to be recovered. And I would love to understand from your perspectives what that meant in terms of, getting acceptance from men in Afghanistan as you were going through, as you were seeking candidacy, for instance, Mariam, or Gaisu, as you were, working as a professional in Afghanistan, what that was like, because I think it's important just to have an idea of, after these 3 years, if the Taliban were to go away, what the next periods are going to look like for adjustment, just to understand kind of if we can go that far back in 5 years that you had to travel this route, what's going to happen after those 20 years of effort, if that makes sense. And I don't know who wants to start, Mariam or Gaisu. I'll let you guys decide that.
I think as a gender justice, expert, that I'm really involved in around, so many activities and projects in Afghanistan for years. I am not claiming that the Afghan society has been, a perfect society for women. It's not. We are speaking of a patriarchal society where the majority of its people are illiterate due to war and conflict for years. And I remember I was very young. I was going to school. I was going to a hidden school during the first time when the Taliban actually came to Afghanistan. And it's funny because I remember the Taliban came to our school to see, to actually check what's going on in school. I was taller than all my classmates, and I wasn't allowed to stand in that group because I was looking old enough, and the Taliban would kick me out of school, right? And we were not allowed to wear our uniforms, and we were just allowed to wear our regular clothes so that they would not identify us. The Taliban killed my father. They kidnapped my father in 2000. And then who never came back, right? And my father is gone for 24 years now. That actually happened in 2000, right? And I was forced married to, a warlord son who had a Taliban affiliation. And I escaped that marriage, and for the price of losing my father, looking at all these experiences I had. And I returned back home, because you know why I returned back home after 2015 when I graduated from University of Virginia? Because I remembered that my mom said, listen, you experience child marriage. There are hundreds of Afghan girls who are experiencing child marriage in Afghanistan. You need to come back to help them. I think for 20 years, we had that space to help. It was not a perfect scenario. We had explosions all the time that the Taliban caused, for sure, that they're forgetting right now, and how many people they actually killed, and how many journalists they killed, how many women's rights defenders they actually killed in the country. But I think we had this space, right? We had this space where we could navigate ways to help each other, to raise awareness about women's rights in the country, to make sure that we have male allies, to make sure that we explain ourselves to our families, to have family supports, to have community supports. I remember we had different shuras that's called CDC shuras around the country, that 50% of those shuras were women. When the Taliban came in, the first thing they did, they actually canceled those shuras because they didn't want women to come in this, in these communities and be part of decision makers in the communities. Imagine we had all of this progress. We adjusted ourselves. We just learned after 20 years how to do advocacy, how to navigate ways, how to bring men allies, right? How to educate our next generation to have a more just system in the country. Boom, the Taliban comes in, and then you go back to zero. Imagine, I don't know if, I was talking to some teachers in Afghanistan, and they were complaining about their salaries. I said, you know what? A year from now, if the international community will not give what the Taliban asked for, they will also cut your 5,000 salaries. They will also not let you teach. They will not allow you. They want you to die within your rooms, within your houses, and you will not even be moved from your house to the graveyard because you're a woman. I mean, I think going forward, the way it goes right now, I think one of the things that give us hope, I think, is the resistance movements. I don't think the people of Afghanistan will be silent. I don't think the people of Afghanistan will tolerate the way that the Taliban are going right now. I am hoping that there will be some sort of strong resistance coming from Afghanistan with the support of us and exile, right, to come together and fight this regime. I think that going forward, the fight is going to be really hard, especially we are not having the UN system on our side, that proven, right, in the past 2 days. I think what we are not exhausted of the fight that we have decided to do. I think that needs to happen. We need to make sure that we are connected with the people, with the women inside Afghanistan. We need to make sure that we are really strategic in terms of our more sustainable advocacy and fight toward the Taliban.
Especially in the last 20 years, we were able to rebuild and build what we see today in Afghanistan through a war, through the biggest war in the entire world. So we have to give credit where credit's due. Everything that you see today, all of the facilities, all of the infrastructure, every project that the Taliban is trying to take credit for, this was built off of the mines that were built in the last 20 years. It was a hard battle. I wasn't there for the full 20 years. I was there in the last 10 years. But I spent time, 2 years before I went into parliament, teaching rural women, nomadic Kuchi women, and that's how I got to parliament in the first place. There was a change happening through society. Through my campaign, I'll tell you right now, through the most conservative society in Afghanistan, the Kuchis, they believed in me. They would constantly tell me that we trust you more because you are a woman. I want my daughter to have that life, but I don't want my brother or my neighbor to know about it. And that peer pressure existed in Afghanistan. A lot of men wanted to support their daughters to even higher positions, but they were afraid what the society would say. And where did this mentality come from? It came from those madrasas across the Duran line in Pakistan and through this Taliban indoctrination. And it was especially done in the Pashtun areas. That was where majority of the schools were burnt down. That was where the majority of the conservatism happened. And I'll give you an example. One of my Kuchi tribal elders, one of my favorite ones, he just understood the entire situation and what needed to happen for Afghanistan to get to peace. And he believed in women's rights wholeheartedly. One day the Taliban come to his tent, and in front of his family, they asked him to come outside, and they blew off the top part of his head, just because of the idea that my daughters might be someone one day. We had a robotics team, a globally renowned gold medalist robotics team. We had an amazingly talented football team that's world renowned. We had our UN ambassador was a woman at one point. Our US ambassador was a woman. Our deputy ministers, in every ministry we had women. If it wasn't the minister herself, we had a deputy minister. We had one of the largest percentages of females in parliament. We had governors, we had mayors, and forget all of that, the businesswomen, the influencers, the restaurateurs, the chefs, the artists. We had everything. And if you bring it down even more basic, we had millions upon millions of women who are getting educated and were educated, coming back with scholarships from the greatest universities in the world. What do we have today? We have women who are scared. We have women who are not allowed to get an education. We have women who are so scared that their sons don't get education, so they send them just to a madrasa. And why? Why are the Taliban doing this? Why are they so scared of women? They're not scared of women. They're just weaponizing it. They know exactly what they're doing. An educated woman would never allow their child to be misused for some twisted version of Islam that the Taliban are trying to sell. They will be able to read the Quran themselves. They will be able to understand it, and they want the best for their child. So whenever you have a scared, an illiterate mother, what is she going to do? She's going to do whatever the Taliban says. So when we see a societal change, when it benefits the Taliban, they're going to allow for schools to be open again. They're going to understand the worth of women, which is much greater than they'll ever see. And even recently, one of the influencers of the Taliban that I mentioned before, General Mubin, he had said himself that the Taliban do not ever plan on opening women's schools again. The Taliban themselves are saying we're never going to open women's schools again. I'm happy about it. I don't want my kids to go to a Taliban school. But what is the world doing about it? Just to make it easy, it's like for people in the West to understand, it's like the KKK or the Nazis being given a second chance to a country, and the rest of the world just being like, okay, it's fine. It's fine. I still can't wrap my head around this about how it's okay for my people to suffer on this scale. Not my people, but the Afghan nation.
So let's go back to the first Doha agreement, when it was negotiated under Trump. I'd like each of you to tell me what you thought about that, if it was going to work or if things were going to be bad for Afghan women as a result of what was discussed in those negotiations. And if you want to instead talk about the actual withdrawal itself, and, the Taliban assured us that Afghan women were going to have rights under the Taliban and everything was going to be great. And I just love to know what you thought about that, if you spoke out about it, and what the world said to you at the time. I will, Jason, I'll let you start.
I helped set up the mechanism that would create the High Peace Council and have, if it was ever to be possible for there to be peace talks, set up that mechanism. When we set that up, the goal was to use peace talks to disempower the Taliban and the terrorist organizations, and to make them understand and listen to the rest of Afghanistan, not to weaken the government. That was never the goal, not to weaken the Afghan government. It was completely misused. Khalilzad wrote a horrible agreement. It could have been enforced, and they might have actually gotten somewhere, but they didn't even try to enforce it. They knew from the very first month that the Taliban had lied about everything and were not going to do anything. And then they just left it out there and did not enforce it, which was a signal to all of the people of Afghanistan that America just wanted to leave. If you write a document that has clear things that you can enforce and you don't enforce any, you're not even trying. So it started as a diplomatic move, and then it just became a surrender document. And as we started to say, hey, you have to enforce it. I was loudly speaking with the Afghan spokesperson, Siddiqui, that, hey, here are the things that are not being done. We have to enforce it. If we don't enforce it, we need to back out of it. Because if you don't back out of it, Afghanistan will collapse. You're cutting the legs out from under the government. And the press didn't care in America, and the press didn't care. I think most NATO nations were more than happy to leave if America left. And so everybody ignored what was going to happen. And as we got closer and closer to August, after Biden made his announcement that he was going to take everything out and all of NATO with it, we all told everybody what was going to happen eventually, and it happened faster than anybody envisioned. It's just a catastrophe. And now that we're still doing these so-called diplomatic engagements with the Taliban, if they've proven they don't care, they're never going to negotiate. They don't do it. I think, and I've advised diplomats since Trump thought about doing that in 2018. I said, if you want to do peace talks again, then you need to use it to empower the Afghan government. Don't use it for any other purpose. Don't try to deal with them, because they don't deal. And instead, we went the other way. And we're doing it now. The UN is leading these talks, and they are using them to empower the Taliban and disempower the people of Afghanistan. I just think these are either the worst diplomats in the world, or they're really evil, and they're pretending this is diplomacy to empower the Taliban and get them recognized. I can't understand. Nobody's that dense. So what is the case? They must be that bad at diplomacy. We need to replace all these people with folks who get it, and have hundreds of women advisors from Afghanistan sitting with every diplomat talking about every possible decision. And the Taliban should be outside the room begging to get in and feeling smaller and smaller as they're disempowered by the world. That's what diplomats should spend their time on doing, organizing all the rest of the people of Afghanistan, the 90% who hate the Taliban. Organize them, help them figure out the way forward. You can't do it for them. And as Mariam said, and Gaisu said, it's going to bubble up. There's going to be, some kind of resistance against this regime. Help them organize to get there. This doesn't have to be a military thing. It can be a political thing at first. It can be diplomatic. Help them get there financially, humanitarian-wise, without slipping the money to the Taliban under the table or having just steal it off the top of the table. We've just got to be smart about this. You can't keep giving gifts to terrorists. It's suicidal, and it's genocidal for all the people living in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's going to be my follow-up on this, is the future and what we can do. So I want to, Gaisu, can you tell me about your thoughts on, what Doha meant to you, what the withdrawal meant?
It's interesting when the Doha talk started, me with my other feminist friends, we were five, we started a campaign called um, Feminine Perspective Campaign. So what we did at that time was to go around the country to collect stories of women whose life were impacted by the Taliban between 1996 and 2001. We wanted to collect evidence, archive them, write it, and analyze it. And we were also connected to all these women who were in the negotiation team. We wanted to feed them with the content and the information so that they could use it during the negotiation, right? Because these women probably, we thought that there wasn't enough content of how women felt and the first time when the Taliban came in and how lives were impacted. We had to do through oral stories. We started those campaigns. I think we were fooled. We were very naive. I mean, women rights activists on the ground. I mean, I'm looking at my experience, looking at how Doha happened and how I lived in the United States. I knew a little bit of how their diplomatic, engagement was working and wasn't working, and their experiences and how they started the war in Afghanistan. I have never, ever felt that the U.S. is going to leave. To the point that I was in the civil service at that time, I was a commissioner. The Ghazni province collapsed, and I had a person who came from Ghazni, and he had a complaint from recruitment process, and I was processing those complaints. And he said, I need to have my position in Ghazni. And I looked at him and I said, Ghazni is not in our hand anymore. It collapsed. And he looked at me and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I guess the U.S. is sending another 3,000, military on the ground. I think we're going to be okay, right? And I think it was our naivety probably at that time to not know how the U.S. or the UN plays or how the international community plays with our rights. I think we were very naive at that time. If we knew enough, right, and what was happening behind the doors, right, and the way that they set up the negotiation and the process that they started with the Taliban, if we had enough information and we had some sort of, I guess, first-hand information what the deal was, I think we would be in a better place in terms of advocacy fighting the Taliban. I think we were put in a hold for not sharing anything with us, or we were not able to have access to any enough data to strategize until the collapse happened. Even it happened, I think I had an interview. It was an amazing interview with a woman in Kabul today. I talked for 2 hours. She told me, she said, you know what, for 10 days I didn't leave my room or my house because I thought the whole country just stopped. So no one is breathing. And I didn't know how to act. After 10 days when I left the house, I was like, oh, people are actually moving. People are actually going to markets. On the third day when I left Kabul, I remember that as if it was a ghost city that I couldn't recognize. And I couldn't make the connection. That is an experience that all of us have with us. That we may not forget, and that's part of our history, that's part of our experience, that's part of our narratives. But I think as we are going forward with August 15th again, but I think what happens is that after 3 years of griefs, I think we became stronger. We came back together. I think women from Afghanistan came back together. I think we are in a position where we can actually hold, member states accountable. I think we do have that strength. I think we have enough international allies. I think that 3 years of experience fighting this battle, I think we are in a position where we can strategize better. And I'm hoping that we will get better, and hopefully that we'll have more men on our side to strategize and be really strategic. I think if the UN member states are going to play with us, we have to learn their techniques.
That is the hope, right? That all of this experience can be used for good eventually, and that you do understand the playbook. We all know the Taliban's playbook, right? And now it's like, okay, international community, how do we work with you? Because you clearly have your heads stuck somewhere that we would prefer your heads were not stuck. Mariam, what about you? What about Doha, the withdrawal, and what you were saying, and what people said at the time to you?
Well, we have to remember that this entire process didn't start with Trump. It started with Obama. That's where it originally started. This entire mess, I guess a lot of the administration was switched out when Obama came in, and I think that's the root of where we are today. Then Trump came in, and I think he went with what Obama had set in place, which was probably what anyone would do. And then Biden came in, this administration came in, and probably made the biggest blunder in American history, destroying millions upon millions of lives in Afghanistan. And I don't think the reaction from this administration or how they've taken care of the withdrawal or anything is something that I could ever speak lightly about. I'm really upset about it. And I don't think any other president would have done the withdrawal the same way, number one. But we have to remember that we need people who really understand Afghanistan in the United States. It is what it is. In the US government, we need people like yourself, like Jason Howk, people who understand the Afghan people who understand humanity, people who understand how important it is for women to have rights, people to understand, okay, let's not weaponize an entire tribe of people. We don't need to, the war on terror, fighting terrorism it's not just bullets and night raids and drone attacks. It's empowering those villages to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. Allow them to have a life. Allow them to have something to live for tomorrow. So they don't have to join a madrasa. So they don't have to join a terrorist organization. So when we're looking at the foundational issues, we can go really deep on that. Right now, we're seeing that the Haqqanis, there's a report that came out yesterday on Zawiya News that their foundation is being fully funded now by the Chinese. The majority of the media in Afghanistan is being influenced by Chinese media. The Chinese have a huge cultural influence now, a huge media. Where is that coming from? Are we blind? It's coming again from Pakistan, the same exact place. And what happens? Chinese are funding one side of it. The Americans come and fund the other side. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Let's look at where the American taxpayer money is going. And let's go to where the foundation and the root of the problem is, and let's get creative. So if the right people really want to find the right solution, the people exist there. People like Gaisu, people like yourselves, many other Afghans are around the world, and there's more than enough seats at the table for us all to sit down and find a new solution, not just what we've been trying for decades now, supporting Islamists, and that's not the way it works. That's not how we're going to bring peace to this world. So I have a lot of hope, but it's in people like yourselves, and it's in the women of the world to stand on the right side of history, and to remember that they're privileged. And it's not too long ago where their ancestors were oppressed. So now we have a duty with this privilege that we have in the West to stand up and raise our voices for the women who are back home in Afghanistan, where over 20 million human beings are being oppressed. Not a women's rights crisis, a human rights crisis that is going to have long-term implications. For us to clean up this mess, it's going to take decades of what the Taliban are doing. So the sooner they're out, the sooner we can try to fix what they've already damaged. And I hope it happens soon. Thank you again.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have your thoughts. And the last thing I want to ask, this is something that it's a weird and maybe an uncomfortable question. There are, right after the fall, everything was disparate. Everybody is scattered to the wind. You've got, new diaspora units all over the place. And I don't know if that's why this happened, but there were many different resistance groups starting, right? And some of them were starting to kind of like, well, I'm the resistance group and I'm the resistance group. And so you've got lots of different voices and so many amazing Afghan women who started their own charities, right? And then you've got, all these different groups doing their thing and not like one joined giant government in exile type operation. Do you think that that's still going on? And is that a mischaracterization from me? Because I obviously was looking at this as an outsider, not part of it, but kind of seeing, okay, there are all these different groups that are not really coalescing. And then the second part of that would be, what are there any other impediments to creating like a larger government in exile, or creating a larger, just one resistance front instead of multiple that are kind of trying to share a space?
I think number one,
Yeah.
the Afghans who are out of the country from every level, from the soldiers to the elites to the regular shop owner who is now in a privileged situation, they have trauma, they have PTSD, they have a collective trauma that not a lot of people talk about. And it's not an easy solution to heal that trauma. They have a lot of anger, they have survivor's guilt, they have depression, their anger is coming out in different ways against one another, the blame game, which leads to nothing. We can blame one another all we want, but the reason Afghanistan is in the situation today is not because of Afghans. It's because of the international community. So all of the resistance groups exist. All of the politicians want to have a unified government in exile. But whenever the world is shutting the door in your face and telling you you're not saying what we want to hear, we want to hear, we want to work with the Taliban, how can we work with the Taliban? You start getting discouraged. And that PTSD and that trauma starts coming out at one another. But organizations like Global Friends of Afghanistan that Jason is spearheading, that gives me a lot of hope. He's gathering Afghans from everywhere, and he's the mediator. He's not speaking, but he's allowing everyone to speak and find the solutions themselves. It's a really organic process that he started. And I feel like that's the only light at the end of the tunnel that I've seen in the last few years has been Global Friends of Afghanistan. And the solution exists in there. He's found, I think, every Afghan that's really clean-hearted and wants to find a solution. Jason has found it, and he's navigating through the drama, which is, there's a lot of, I'm sure he can write a book about it, but he deserves to be the ambassador of Afghanistan one day, because you get your Afghan tazkara because of how well you know our people and how well you're able to mitigate all of the drama. So again, thanks for what you do at Global Friends, and I feel like that's the foundation of a free Afghanistan, a democratic Afghanistan, an Afghanistan where women and children and men and elderly, everyone has rights and their voices are heard, and it's a safe place for people. So that's the dream for me, and I have hope it'll happen.
I love that. And I agree. Jason, I'll say it again. It's just I said this in the episode about the songs, but like you just kind of gather these people around you and you're this unstoppable force that creates good in the world. And I agree that GFA is a bright light out there. And it's really incredible that you are fostering that positive atmosphere. And I think the most important thing you said, Mariam, is Jason, I've seen this with you. You're not trying to run anything. You're saying what you believe, but GFA isn't about you. It's about letting Afghan voices make Afghan choices instead of having, which has been the problem for the last 20 years, Western ideas trying to, or Sean Carberry came on here and he's a journalist and he said that the way he saw things was like the Americans were trying to build a second floor on top of an unstable first floor. Not that Afghanistan was an unstable first floor, but that they hadn't built the first floor. But they were like, here's this really cool second floor. And like, no, it doesn't fit, A. And like, are you asking people what they want? Anyway, all these things are coming to mind. And Jason, I'd love to have you talk about your thoughts on what could be a way forward.
I think all of us, all of the volunteers who make up Global Friends of Afghanistan, truly from around the world, said that we should exist to make sure the world hears from the people of Afghanistan, not hears one more Western think tank or one more diplomat or one more president calling it a godforsaken country, but hear from the people of Afghanistan what they've gone through and what they want. And I think we've heard tonight what they've gone through and what they want, which are the basic human rights that all of us outside of Afghanistan right now take for granted. I share these stories that I hear from the people of Afghanistan using my secret power of listening. I tell people outside of Afghanistan what I hear, and people in America just go, why don't I hear this on the news? I don't hear anybody saying what you're saying, and that's why we exist, because we knew nobody else was going to tell the stories of Afghanistan and what they're going through. We will continue to do that. It is an easy educational mission. we're one of those nonprofits that does this weird thing where we don't pay anybody. So we know that everybody who's here, it's because they care, and no one's going to get rich. In fact, you will lose money if you help us. So if you want to join the team, be prepared to give up time and money. So that's our secret sauce. We help the people of Afghanistan talk and get together and figure things out in a non-prescriptive way. Our last conference last year was the majority of the organizers, the speakers, the moderators of the conference were women and were from Afghanistan. That's a US-based nonprofit educating people about Afghanistan. We don't need to do it. You don't need me or John Agolio or Annie Forsheimer or anybody else sitting there telling you we wanted the people of Afghanistan. We just play moderator. We have our own opinions, but in the end, it's not for me to go live there. It's not. It is for us to help the people of Afghanistan figure out how to get where they want to go. They know where they want to go. We just need to help them to get there and stop trying to force them to negotiate with a terrorist group or give up some basic human right in order to be part of their country. That's ridiculous. The UN needs to figure out what they stand for, and the US needs to figure out what they stand for in this policy, and I hope the next administration makes that decision.
And I think, what you said too, Mariam, about trauma is so important. This has been a really complex trauma for every Afghan who faced the withdrawal, whether they stayed in Afghanistan and had to live through the Taliban, or whether they were able to get out and had to completely remake their life, usually with the contents of a backpack in a new place, separate from their families. I mean, there are just so many different kinds of trauma ongoing in this process. And unlike, I'm seeing it in the veteran community too. Jason and I have talked about that before. But what the veteran community can avail themselves of, for the most part, is mental health services. And what is not available to so many Afghans are mental health services. So, and there's the proudness of, you don't want to have to know. Like, people don't understand. There's just so many levels of hardship that I think have gone on for Afghans all over. Even people who weren't involved in the withdrawal in any way and just had family there, or had the fact that they love their homeland and watched it torn apart in front of them. I mean, it's just all a lot. So that is a key factor to, as I said, all these different groups and all these different things going on. And yeah, of course, that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad that you brought that up.
Sure. Thank you. I think I agree with Mariam that trauma is a very big component of activists, Afghans in exile going forward. Not only that they are trying to navigate ways to live in these countries, but I think also we are having traumas of conflict for years, for generations. So you also look at intergenerational traumas that our parents are going to bring, right? And on the children's and the next generations, and my generation and the generation after me, perhaps the ones who just grew up in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. That generation is also carrying these traumas through their families and also through the experience they're having in conflict. After the collapse, I started doing a storytelling project that's called Afghan Voices of Hope. I wanted to go to different countries and talk to people and just listen to them, right? Give them a space to come and share. I think we didn't have that opportunity in Afghanistan. I noticed this trauma that exists and what triggers people of their traumas that are not treated, and that perhaps is not really focused or prioritized during the resettlement processes in different countries. I think after 3 years now, as we are noticing, while Afghans were carrying these experiences, traumas, and conflict within them, I think they were still brave enough to register, to resist, to form groups. But I think one of the narratives that I would like to highlight is that, I think the Taliban are using this narrative of us not being united. I think the international community is using the same exact narrative to disperse us. But I think, yes, we do have different opinions. We are different groups. We don't have to be united per se. I think that's my personal opinion, that unity means that you have to come under one umbrella. But I think our fight is the same. I think our values are the same. I think all of us are fighting for the same values. I think that is putting us under one umbrella. Now that I think there are different entities formed, we have different resistance movement around the world that are, I think the Taliban are scared of that, right? They actually survived. I think resettlement, being in exile, didn't push them down. They're still active. They're trying to do advocacy. They're trying to demand to take back Afghanistan and make sure that Afghanistan is going to develop in the near future. What I'm planning to do as we are going forward with August 15th, I am planning to use these storytellings to go back to these storytellers and do workshops. Because what I would like to learn is that what happened to us after 3 years? Are we in a stage where we can come together and I think share our griefs and basically support each other to move on? But I think that safe space is required and needed for us to come back together, to share our stories, to share our 3 years of experience and our resistance, and then also plan our strategies going forward. I think 3 years is enough. While we, I think, did great in terms of fighting the Taliban in different fronts, but I think it's in a personal level, especially for activists and resistance movements, it is a moment for us to come together and talk to each other, right? Understand our gaps, understand our vulnerabilities, and also show solidarity to each other. And I think storytelling can become one of those tools, I think, that push people to come together, right, and share. I think, well, as I said before, we didn't have the opportunity to share before in Afghanistan because of conflict, but I think we are there. And I'm hoping that going forward it will happen. That, you know.
I love that. And it's funny because I always call myself a storyteller before like a journalist, because that is our job as humans, right? Is to tell our stories and to be together and be that's the thing that I think unites us, is that we all have a story, whether it's whatever it is. And I think that that's a brilliant plan, is workshopping that, giving people a safe space to share those really difficult moments. I love that plan.
And I think to move on, if we don't share, I call it from grief to hope, right? That we need to come together and talk about it and move on. I think it is a time enough time actually spent that would put us in a position where we need to move on and be really strategic, because our fight became global. It became even scarier with the fact that what happened in Doha for 3 years, right? And the decisions that are made by the UN and the Taliban and the international community. I think our roads became rough and our fights are going to be really challenging. So we need to be together and show the solidarity to each other and move on and be strategic.
Well, Gaisu has lost connection, so I can't ask her, but what I will try to do is have her come on for a few minutes later this week and film something about her thoughts on all of this. And I just want to give anybody who wants to have a final word, this is your opportunity. Mariam, do you have any final words?
What we're fighting for and what we fought for in the last 20 years was not just Afghanistan. The Afghan National Defense and Security Forces were fighting on the front line of the world war on terror. But unfortunately, they were backstepped. So that's part of the trauma as well. Fighting for a belief system, fighting for values, fighting for democracy, and then at the end of the day, it just being handed over to a group of terrorists. That leaves you wondering why. Why did you even come in the first place? Why did you even start this in the first place? You know what I mean? And we were going towards a beautiful direction. We have to remember that the enemies of Afghanistan, our surrounding neighborhood, that where we live, they understand history very well and our geopolitical situation really well. It was, while I worked in Afghanistan, very rarely did I find someone who was born and raised, both born and raised on the soil of Afghanistan. Either someone was born in Afghanistan and raised abroad in Pakistan or in Iran or in the United States or Europe, or they were raised abroad and then they come back. But 20 years had passed. This was the first generation that was just finishing school, that had a sense of patriotism, that had a sense of nationalism, that grew up in democracy, understanding laws and rule of law and everything. And right as that generation is growing up, remember, we built Afghanistan off of warlords and corruption and fighting the biggest war in the entire world. This generation is just getting to that age where they're entering the system. And at that moment, it collapses. Afghanistan needed more time. We were very young in democracy. It took the United States hundreds of years for it to get to where it is now, from the beginning, right? I think it was 350 years for the United States democracy to fully mature. 20 years is nothing. We didn't even have enough time for our first generation to be able to be absorbed into the government and to see what we were capable of doing. So it's heartbreaking, it's sad, and all we can do is try to find a way for Afghans to have partnerships with Americans, where it's a mutual partnership with the global community, not just the United States, with everyone, where we secure one another. We keep each other safe, right? And I don't think we're going down that route. And right now, when we're looking at the Taliban and women's rights, we're not just looking at the Taliban and women's rights for Afghanistan, but in Saudi, in Qatar, in UAE, you're seeing, in every Muslim country in the world, you're seeing different groups rise up and say, hey, you're not running a Islamic Sharia system, the Taliban are. Why is that happening? So the first thing you're going to see is you're going to see duplicate efforts of what's happened in Afghanistan happening in other countries around the world. And eventually after that, what are you going to see? You're going to start seeing those bloggers and vloggers that are going back to Afghanistan and telling everyone that's great. You're going to start seeing cells happening in the United States. So when I'm screaming into the void and no one wants to listen, the American people are powerful and the American people are good people. I know that. And I hope and I pray that they listen to what I'm saying and know that that danger that you see over there one day is going to be at your doorstep as well. So let's stop it before it happens. It's going to happen in the Islamic world. It's going to happen in Europe. It's going to happen in Africa. It's going to happen everywhere. So if we don't stop it sooner rather than later, it's going to be a catastrophe. And it keeps me up at night thinking about it. So I hope that we can all feel the gravity of the situation and know it's not just about women's rights. It's bigger than that. It's much bigger than that. Thank you again, Beth, for having us. And honestly, thank you for everything that you do. You're an oasis in this desert where no one listens.
I'm just honored to be able to talk to all of you because I've learned so much, and it has changed my life just to be able to listen to these stories. That's how it started, listening to stories, telling stories, getting involved with Jason, all of that. I mean, yes, there was involvement in the past, but the withdrawal really changed the course of my life and it changed it for the better. And I'm grateful to just be fighting a small part of that fight alongside and cheering you all on as you fight for the right things. So,
I mean, those who are listening, I think there are certain things you need to do and you can do that would show us support. I think one is to listen. We have been listened to for too long. I think this is an opportunity for us to be listened to, so that we can have control over our agencies, have control over our narratives. And I think if you show the support, I think we can become stronger even in our communities in these countries. I think that's one message. I think the next message, usually through my story collection, I ask a question, which is an interesting question. I ask all the women and I ask them, if 30 years passes and you will either be in this world or not, what would be one message you will send to the next generation that will be heard inside Afghanistan? There are so many of hopeful messages while, understanding the circumstance and the challenges that we do have in Afghanistan. I think the Afghan women have shown for years that they're going to survive. They're going to survive dark days. We are going to survive, I think, difficult nights without lights. But I think what we really want to ask is the support of the international allies, our friends, brothers and sisters, to be with us. And I think in terms of Doha, this is not the first meeting and it's not going to be the last meeting. This is not the first venue and platform. It's not going to be the last venue and platform. I think it'll be a lot of battles going forward, but just wish us strength in solidarity to take it forward. I think the ideal situation would be that we will have an Afghanistan that will not have Taliban and Taliban's mentality on the ground. What I wish for to see going forward, to go back home, to hug, right, my friends, my families, the young generation that I mentored for so long. I would like to taste the food. I would like to go to the mountains. I would like to hike and camp in Bamiyan. That's what I want to do, and that's what I'm hoping for. And to do that, I think we need to take care of ourselves first, right, as an activists, to take care of our families and surroundings, and then be united to take the fight forward. That is my last thought. Apologies if it's really scattered, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that we need to take care of ourselves first.
It is a really important point. It's something that people have brought up on this podcast before, that you can't help other people with an empty cup. You have to keep your cup full, and that is, if you're burned out, you're not going to help anybody. So you do have to take care of yourself to help other people. I love that. I applaud all of the efforts that you have going on, and I have so much hope that you will go back to Bamiyan and hug all of your friends and family in Afghanistan and have that future where you can determine what it is, and we don't have these stories that we're told about what the Taliban are doing anymore, or have the international community actually cave to them and say, we don't need Afghan women, because we absolutely need Afghan women. I don't think I've ever met a group of women more intent on studying and improving themselves and improving the world than Afghan women. Your voices have to be heard. Jason, any final words from you?
I just want to remind everybody to think about what it would be like to be a 12-year-old girl in Afghanistan today, and to know what your life has in store if the Taliban stay in power. We need to continue to listen to the women of Afghanistan and any journalists who will explain what it's like for them, and take their advice. They're not asking for anything wild or crazy. Human rights are not a wild and crazy concept. It's what the UN should be based upon, and the UN should not be doing anything, and no nation that's part of the UN should be doing anything that's going to undermine those human rights. These are the basic things, and I've crushed in my soul I've spent most of my career working in Afghanistan, and I completely agree with Mariam. It was right at the cusp of a full generation being educated to go do the right thing, and it was taken away right at that moment when you had all those people. And I talked to those people for 20 years. I watched them grow and mature, and then it was all gone in an instant. And that's a cruel, cruel thing. That's what you do if you're a cruel person. You snatch that away, and we haven't done that in other countries we've been in. South Korea is one of the most prosperous countries in the world because we are still there with a massive UN coalition military security footprint that allows all the economic and diplomatic things that need to happen to make it change. And they're still changing. They're still working on women's rights in South Korea. Like, things take time. And we need to remember it's not over for the Afghan people. We can't let it be over for us. We've got to rebuild this trust and rebuild the belief in human rights.
I appreciate that so much. And, Mariam and Jason and Gaisu, even though she's not here to hear this, I just thank you guys so much for talking about Doha and what's going on with women in Afghanistan, and what there could be hope for the future. That's a good anchoring point too. So thank you for sharing your time. I want to thank all the listeners for sharing their time too and supporting the people of Afghanistan. I also just want to put out the call. I haven't done this for a couple weeks just because we haven't gotten any news stories, but the beginning of this podcast, there was always a story from an Afghan audience member about, life under the Taliban, life during the withdrawal, before the withdrawal, anything, any part of your story that you want to share. We want every single episode to contain stories from Afghans, because I'm just some Westerner, whatever, I want Afghan voices in this podcast. So anybody who wants to share a story, send us a detailed letter or maybe a voice message if you like. We can absolutely ensure that you remain anonymous. And you can send that to the show address, which is the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. Tasha Kaur, everyone, and I hope to see you again soon.